The Lupiner stood with his back up against the uneven stone finish of the room, the dampness of the walls seeping into his uniform and fur as he stared blankly into space. The Venerian, meanwhile, seemed adamant on hiding underneath the servant's bed, his whole body quaking as every fiber of his being screamed at him to do something, yet he remained in a hyperventilating state all the same. It was only the Avena princess who remained relatively calm. Her expressions, whilst difficult to read on account of the beak, was still decidedly unmoved by the whole exchange. "Let's head back to orientation now, there's not much time left before it officially starts," was all she said as she walked calmly towards the door, only to be chastised by the Venerian. How the fuck are you so calm? It's because you're a princess, isn't it? You know you won't be affected like the rest of us. You know you're going to get off scot-free. You probably even know the guy personally. There's no point in cowering or panicking, was all Thacia said in response. You learn that the hard way when you're in the royal court. Her tainted aura seemed to shift and shudder at that, forcing the Venerian into silence once more as the Lupiner nodded in agreement. Let's get going then. As tainted as the princess is, she has a point. In battle, there are sometimes losses, sometimes gains. It isn't worth worrying about the long-term implications of recent losses, if you don't live to survive the next battle. So let's make this next battle count. The Lupiner practically growled out towards Ilyuna, but in a complete shift of attitude, gave Thacia a curt nod. Perhaps I may have misjudged you in the opening hours of this battle, princess. Your resolve, at least compared to this lizard's, is stronger than I could have imagined. Thank you. Thacia responded promptly, a smile of relief forming at the edges of her beak. I am merely stating a fact. If we are to survive here, we will all need to share a similar resolve. The Lupiner chimed back, before turning his head towards the now dust-ridden Venerian. A resolve which is severely lacking in our Venerian comrade. Without a second's hesitation the pair promptly left the servant's hideaway. Followed closely behind by Ilyuna who, in his rush, was particularly more dishevelled than when he first entered the room. You made sure to bring your amulets, yes? The Lupiner continued as he slowed down just enough for the Venerian to catch up. So you've heard the rumours too? Thacia inquired back, refusing to respond just yet as she gauged the wolf's expressions with questioning intent. Anyone worth their mettle and their stations would have heard the rumours. Ilyuna suddenly interjected, still winded as his shorter, stubbier legs found it difficult to maintain the long graceful strides the taller pair of misfits were capable of. Yes. So I ask again, did you bring your amulets of dispelling? The Lupiner reiterated, his tone shifting to one that was much more severe, pressing the matter without room for anything beyond a yes or a no answer. Yes. Of course. There isn't any reason not to be careful, especially in such turbulent times. It is troubling to believe that the faculty would be so brazen to attempt the binding ritual on orientation day. Those less fortunate will have no time to prepare, and to my understanding this will be the first time in over 1,000 years that the faculty will be brazen enough to break any of the unspoken rules. Thacia responded, opening up the doors to further discussion as she and the Lupiner both palmed their respective amulets underneath their cloaks, one disguised as a ceremonial dagger, the other disguised as a pendant on a royal necklace. And you, Ilyuna? Have you brought your amulet of dispelling? The Lupiner turned back towards the exhausted Venerian, who only nodded in reply as he struggled to maintain the pair's ungainly pace. Let us hope it does not come to it. However, if it does, then at the very least we will be safe in the knowledge that our group will be protected from the chains of the ritual of the binding charter. Thacia sighed back in apprehension as the pair now found their way back towards the side entrance to the grand reception hall. Do you know the feeling you get when you enter a movie theater 10 minutes past its start? Or that the awkwardness that comes with mingling with strangers at your distant relative's expensive wedding? That was the feeling I was experiencing as I waded my way through the sea of domed dishes and fine silverware that floated to and from each table. Yet unlike the long, communal tables of certain fantastical schools I'd read as a child, this school seemed adamant on modeling itself more like an exclusive dining venue. Closed-off groups had already clearly formed as evidenced by their active conversations and dismissive glares. Species-exclusive tables were likewise scattered about, particularly true for the elves and those of draconic descent. Indeed, there wasn't a single table that was available save for the strangely out-of-place circular one tucked away in a far corner of the room. One that was clearly supposed to seat 4, but at this point was empty. I realized this was probably my best bet, even if this meant I wouldn't be mingling with the locals for the duration of this orientation. Great. We're back to middle school politics on who sits with who. This was supposed to be a college, everyone here's my age, why aren't they acting like it? My thoughts and growing anxiety were quickly replaced by a far more pressing matter however, as I sat down at the table, and felt the unmistakable feeling of a chair far too fragile for the immense weight of my suit. My heart skipped a beat as I felt my whole body clench whilst I struggled to shift my weight to avoid, or at least delay the inevitable. The engineers back at home probably hadn't even accounted for this exact scenario, and probably any other scenario that didn't involve outright utility, maintenance, repair, or survival. Ergonomic functionality in day-to-day social interactions was probably the last thing on their minds when designing and constructing this thing, and it was beginning to show. But what else could I do? Stand? I knew that I'd just have to chance it. Placing half of my weight on the chair and the other half on my calves as I maintained an awkward, almost painful seated position, all in an attempt to prevent the unthinkable from happening in the middle of what was perhaps the most important day of the year. First impressions were everything, and I'd already started off on an unsavory foot with that speech. Not to mention the troubling implications of their gossiping whispers. Yet it was just as I had managed to acclimate myself that a new unexpected variable entered the picture, in the form of 3 additional students who quickly joined my table in a hurried sprint. The 3 seemed to halt dead in their tracks when they spotted me, as their eyes strayed throughout the room, in some last-minute attempt to scour for any other available seats. When it became clear this wouldn't be possible however, the 3 began to resign themselves to their respective fates. The small, diminutive, somewhat disheveled-looking draconic lizard seemed to just be done with it all, simply sinking into his seat with a sigh of defeat. The werewolf-looking creature however, seemed dead set on just staring me down, as if sizing me up for a fight. Finally, the most striking of the bunch, what most resembled a tropical bird, seemed to have given me a single glance before turning back towards the various other points of interest scattered throughout the room. The bird in particular stood out the most, despite being dressed in the drab greys and blacks of the Academy's uniform. What plumage was still visible stuck out in stark contrast with the otherwise repetitive gold, silver, marble, and granite of the castle. This was probably why even more eyes were drawn to us now, as our little corner had become an eclectic collection of oddities to gawk at. I was so focused on the various eyes and hushed voices fixated on us that I didn't notice the bird's gaze shifting towards me. Without any warning, other than a soft barely audible whisper from her beak, a flurry of alarms assaulted my HUD. Yet as quickly as the alert had sounded, so too did it vanish from view, as the radiation levels dropped back down to background levels after a few short seconds. I shot an accusatory glance at what I assumed was the perpetrator behind this with a grunt of annoyance, shifting my weight around in my seat. Only to realize that the seat no longer felt like it was about to give way. A sharp, shocked exhale of disbelief escaped from my vocoder, garnering the attention of the 2 and an ever so subtle smile from the bird. Or at least what I assumed was a smile. I cocked my head at the avian stranger as she reciprocated with a knowing nod. It was at this point that I finally broke my minutes-long silence with as appreciative of a response I could muster. "Emma Booker, thanks for the save there. Princess Thacia Delony, it's my pleasure. A princess. A real, honest-to-God, princess? My mind had struggled to register that. The past half hour alone was just about enough to overwhelm my head with an inundation of experiences completely removed from my reality. From magic, to mythical races, to talking birds, and an entirely alien civilization that I had no context for, everything here was just about pushing the limits of my sanity. But in a good way. A part of me thought to myself as I felt a mix of conflicting feelings bubbling up to the surface. There was an intrusive excitement that came with the novelty of it all, of actually being in a place that should have been reserved for the pages of a fantasy novel or the fleeting hours of a D&D session. It was sickeningly nostalgic, and provocatively exciting, but I had to keep it in check. The reality I was in was nothing like those fantasies. Despite my deepest desires to believe it. I quickly pushed aside those intrusive thoughts as I attempted to focus on the task at hand, which at this point was just trying my best to fit in. Something that was much easier said than done given the obvious barrier that was the suit. You know, where I come from, stories usually start off with the knight saving the princess, and not the other way around. I manage out with a chuckle, attempting to break the ice with my own off-brand humor which I think worked. It was difficult to really tell with a face that was dominated by a beak rather than a mouth or even a snout. Combine this with what was perhaps years of whatever manners or social training Thacia had received as a royal, and it was clear that I'd have to be laser-focused on all of our discussions, or risk being lost in the sea of social cues that existed for royalty and nobility. Well, you'll be quite happy to know that those preconceived notions are quite well and alive here in the Nexus as it is in most adjacent realms. The princess began. Her voice was sharp, but rich, somewhere between a parrot's mimicry and an owl's deep hooting. There was a certain restraint in the way she spoke, even with this little piece of banter. Are you? The princess continued, her eyes clearly fixated on my armor rather than the person inside it. If you'll excuse my presumptuous line of questioning, of course, but am I correct in assuming you're a knight of your realm? Perhaps a squire, given how knighthoods are most usually bestowed well beyond the academy's age of matriculation. I blinked for a few moments, feeling as if I was thrust into an interview or a social function reserved for the director and her military brass. If this were any other situation I would have just been done with it, and answered with the first thing that came to mind, but this wasn't like any other situation. So whatever answer I gave had to be heavily audited. How would you even begin to explain the concept of an ROTC cadet to someone from an era that didn't even have a proper standing army? Or did they? Wait, did they have standing armies in the medieval era? Could the medieval era even be used as a point of reference for the Nexus and whatever the adjacent realms were? There certainly wasn't anything in the massive PSYOP, Social Integration and Operations Protocol, manual that could have prepared me for a face-to-face interaction with royalty of all things. To the credit of the PSYOP's authors though, no one could have ever expected any of this. Knights and squires aren't really a thing in my world anymore, actually. I replied confidently, puffing my chest up as if to compensate for my utter lack of understanding for what constituted proper social etiquette here. Though that probably didn't do much given the suit was in the way of any real body language to be read. This answer however proved to be lacking, as the princess raised a single brow in response, leaning forward in her seat, as she allowed my words to linger in the air. It was as if she was going through and dissecting the implications of my claims methodically, her eyes not even making the effort to hide the analytical mind behind it. A mind that was more than likely going to throw some curveball of a question back my way. A realm without knights and squires, eh? The wolf-looking creature finally interjected, completely cutting off what was probably going to be a carefully worded line of questioning from the princess. This caught me off guard, as my attention was now squarely focused on this hulking mass of a creature. If Thacia was a princess, what I assumed was a member of a royal household, Then what right did this wolf have to interrupt her like that? The only assumption I could make was that perhaps he was higher up the ladder than she was, and that thought alone was definitely something to be worried about. Yes, that's correct. I answered curtly, making sure to balance my dislike of his interruption with caution regarding his place in the social pecking order here. HMMPH. He scoffed back, as he sized me up again, his predatory eyes managing to lock with my own underneath those opaque lenses, sending shivers down my spine. Yeah, nah, not buying it. You got a better cover story, or are we going to be dealing with a spineless liar and a charlatan for the rest of the school year? He boldly announced, catching me off guard as I noticed the princess mellowing back into the background as the tension grew. Part of me wanted to avoid confrontation, to just explain away the situation carefully. Another part of me knew, however, that yielding softly wouldn't help matters. Especially not with someone who was clearly trying to assert themselves like this. A distant part of me wanted to demonstrate the utter obsolescence of knights in shining armor by pulling out my sidearm. This was, of course, a distant thought for a reason. Maybe another time. Those are big words to throw around, pal. I spoke, letting what little of a polite front I was putting up crumble away as I leaned in closer towards the table. You caught that much just from one sentence alone, did you? Listen. I don't take too kindly to being called a liar before I've even been properly introduced to the person throwing those punches, so why don't we clear up the air a little here, start with names and introductions, then address whatever lies you think I'm spouting. I offered, trying my best to de-escalate the situation, but also making it clear that I wasn't about to take his crap lying down. I'll start. I'm Emma Booker, what's your name? Thalmin. Prince Thalmin Havenbroke of the Lupiner Court. The Lupiner spoke with little in the way of pomp and circumstance, but rather, with an air of underlying aggression that saw his maw curl up in a snarl with his rows of canine-like teeth brought to bear. It's actually mercenary Prince Thalmin Havenbroke of the Lupiner Court. The diminutive lizard piped up, finally deciding to enter the conversation, his eyes facing me with equal parts confusion, anxiety, and genuine intrigue. I must apologize for my ill-mannered friend here, this is very much typical of Lupiner Court nobility, and even Maressa with their royalty, he continued, as if trying to vie for my attention as it was clear now that all eyes were firmly on me. You will watch your tongue, Ilyuna, or you will find it, and the rest of the head it's attached to, missing from your shoulders by night's end. Thalmin shifted his aggression towards the small lizard, who fell short of impressed let alone intimidated by the Lupiner's antics. Let us not beat around the bush. Ilyuna spoke, completely ignoring Thalmin's threats and focusing the line of questioning squarely on me. Squires and knights, court etiquette and chivalry, lies and whatnot, all of it can be discussed later. What we need to know right now. His tone softened as he paused in the middle of his sentence to mutter out something under his breath. Something which caused my HUD to once again be assaulted by a barrage of warnings. Warnings that disappeared within a few seconds, just as it had been with Thasia's use of magic. However, unlike the chair, I didn't notice any difference to me, or my immediate surroundings. That was until I noticed that my long-range listening sensors were all but dead, as it felt as if there was an acoustic bubble that had enveloped our table. I assumed this probably worked both ways, so while we couldn't hear what was happening on the other side of the bubble, so too would our conversations be completely inaudible to the rest of the room. Is what you're doing here in a full suit of armor? Armor that is clearly concealing your mana fields. Tell us, Emma of Earthrealm, have your kind developed a way to hide the sickness of mana field taint? Ilyuna, please quiet princess, if we are to move forward as a peer group, we mustn't hide such pressing matters from one another. The lizard snapped, cutting Thasia off, as it became clear to me that these two were not above knocking her down at every possible turn despite her royal rank. It sickened me to my stomach. That must be the only reason behind your ridiculous insistence on wearing a full suit of armor to the academy. Why else would someone try to mask their mana fields? In fact, I don't even think there's anyone underneath that suit at all. Are you perhaps a golem, or some artificed slave soul trapped in metal? There's no other explanation as to why you are able to sit there, exuding nothing. Like a lifeless suit of armor. The lizard turned around to face Thalmin, then Thacia, who sat there with a look of growing concern. You all feel it. I know you can. There's no mana field within or around that thing. It's like a slave is sitting at our table. How else would this thing feel so lifeless and dead? He reiterated, forcing Thacia to slink back further into her seat as the Lupiner grew quieter and quieter still. I'm just saying what's on everyone's mind. He quickly added. What the fuck is your problem? I shot back through my vocoder, the volume alone causing the diminutive lizard to slink firmly back against his seat. I stood up, the full 7 feet 4 inches height of my suit easily surpassing the lizard's height twice over. Whether it was the stress of the whole situation, or the fact that my hands were practically splintering the table at the seams, Thacia finally snapped back. Enough? It was at this point that my sensors reported another surge of magical radiation. Except this time it wasn't capping out or remaining fixed at a certain percentage over the background radiation, but was fluctuating wildly. Soon after the variable fluctuation of mana field energy, I felt the audio nullifying bubble around us pop, as the sounds of the room were once more audible, forcing all of us to step back from each other's throats before I heard yet more gossip from afar. This time targeted towards the avian. Ha! Seems like the tainted princess just had a little breakdown. I'm surprised they even sent her to the academy. Only the gods and goddesses know when her taint will overwhelm her mana fields. It will spell death for everyone here. May her peer group find solace in their quick and timely demise. Wait, group. I parroted out, which garnered the attention of everyone at the table. Are we so our knight in shining armor finally gets it? Yes, our group. The table you sit with at orientation will dictate your peer group for the rest of the academic year. The lizard hissed back, as he refused to meet my gaze, instead, focusing on domed dishes in front of him. I believe this is why Prince Thalmin Havenbroke, and Lord Ilyana Ruleria here are currently on edge. It is a huge risk for the three of us to be paired with a being which we lack any knowledge of. As a result of this, and in addition to the great number of stressors we each faced prior to our arrival at the academy, there exists a great deal of tension which both Thalmin and Ilyana seem to be resolving with fear, anger, and frustration. For that I must apologize, Emma of Earthrealm. The avian gave me the slightest hint of a head nod that I reciprocated in kind. I wanted so desperately to punt the lizard across the room, perhaps even knock Thalmin down a peg, but I knew they were probably acting out of stress. I could empathize. Conflict to escalation was what was keeping me back, although it was a bit harder to do with the lizard. It's fine. I get it. I literally just survived being turned into a pile of liquefied goop just a half hour ago. We all have our issues to contend with, I sighed, placing both hands on the table in front of me. I'm willing to answer any questions you have, but let's just try to be a bit more civil, okay? I offered, putting that olive branch out there as the wolf seemed to be willing to play ball, nodding and leaning forward. The lizard has a point. He began. We need to know why the armor, Emma. His tone was far more subdued now, but still carried a certain severity behind it. I looked everyone dead in the eye, and despite them all being unable to see my eyes underneath the lenses, I tried my best to maintain eye contact all the same. Part of me wondered if I should evade the question, but I knew that if this really was to be my group for the rest of the year, healthy communication would be key. If I take this off I die, I stated bluntly, eliciting reactions I more or less expected. "Dramatic," Ilyana whispered under his breath. The wolf, however, didn't seem to mind as he gestured for me to continue with a single nod of his head. "Go on. I'm not sure if the Academy told you this. I mean, judging from how gossipy this place is." I gestured to the tables behind us to illustrate my point. "It would be kinda surprising if you guys hadn't heard, but the previous human student who tried to cross the threshold just ended up melted. The suit is all that stands in the way between me and that fate." I shuddered, a tinge of concern dripping with every word, as just admitting that fact made me acutely aware of just how precarious my position here was. The whole room looked so normal, yet for all intents and purposes it was effectively the vacuum of space to me. "How is that possible?" Thacia began, only to have her line of questioning cut short by a series of 3 loud thumps. Each thump reverberated louder and louder as all eyes shot towards a part of the room that I could have sworn didn't exist just a moment prior. A quick look at my HUD revealed that a small spike of radiation was detected, hinting at the fact that there was probably some magic involved with all of this. What appeared in front of us was an entire stage, elevated about 5 feet above the floor and connected to the floor via a series of levitating marble staircases. "Attention! Students to be from the Nexus and adjacent realms alike. The orientation is about to commence." A voice echoed throughout the room, belonging to none other than the blue-robed professor who just apparated alongside a group of 25 similarly cloaked humanoids who stood at attention behind him. Each of them seemed to belong to a different race, most seemed elvish, but a scant few stood out as draconic, and even cat-like. My eyes focused on one figure, however. A tall, graceful, regal-looking elf draped in a cloak that was pure white. So white in fact that I could swear it practically radiated light itself. Something told me this was more than likely the man in charge of the whole operation. "The Transgracian Academy for the Magical Arts welcomes each and every one of you." The white-robed figure spoke, moving forwards to completely overshadow Vanavan. "For those of you who do not know, I am Dean Altalan Rur Astya, the 2592nd Dean of this Academy, and the 4th in my lineage to hold such an honor." The Dean continued, as the rest of the professors behind him fell in line, standing in 3 distinct rows, with the black-robed Maltari and blue-robed Vanavan standing immediately behind him. "Now, I expect most of you to have read up on your history, but because we are blessed with a new realmer amongst our ranks," the Dean's eyes shifted towards me, and so did the entire room and 3 rows of professors. Thanks to the suit, no one could gauge my reactions, but underneath, I was practically melting alive. I deem it best to provide a brief summary of the significance of this academy to the balance that is the Nexus realm accords. In the beginning, there was nothing. Nothing but the Nexus itself. This Nexus, however, wasn't one any of us today would recognize, for it existed as a world of pure mana, where the gods existed in peace and harmony. This harmony, however, was not fated to last. For out of this realm of mana came another being, a god in everything but name. His taint and miasma infected the realm, and out of this taint came sin, and out of this sin came discord, and from that came the corruption of the old gods, and the eventual war in the heavens which forever shattered the perfection that was the old Nexus. Yet from the ashes came the seeds of new life, the adjacent realms, born as but an afterthought, without purpose, without direction. Conversely, forged from the wisdom of the new gods came the new Nexus, a creation of love and commitment. A commitment to forge a better world of enlightened beings. Beings which comprise up much of the Academy's faculty and staff. The Dean gestured to himself, and the staff which stood unflinchingly behind him. The Academy was constructed to bridge the gap that exists between the Nexus and the adjacent realms, to teach and enlighten those with the gift of mana, and to elevate the adjacent realms from its natural tendencies of barbarism to one of civility. We exist to bring the enlightenment of the gods to the lightless. The dean's monologue was capped off with an unwavering smile, one that only grew in confidence as he went on. Students from the Nexus and adjacent realms. By order of the Transgracian Accords of 10,092, under the blessings of all the adjacent realms and approved by the holy decree of His Majesty the King, I hereby announce the official start to this academic school year and the induction of the class of 29,019. Yet instead of the cheers and claps of any other such announcement, what I saw before me was a room filled with dread. He can't do that. I heard several voices whisper throughout the room. The orientation still hasn't even begun. A few more spoke, before silence eventually dominated the entire room. The formerly chatty and well-composed crowd had all but lost their composure at that proclamation, and what's more, quite a few began to fidget with their uniforms, specifically with something hidden underneath them. Murmurs were heard from the faculty on stage as Van Aven stepped forward to the dean, whispering something into his ear which only elicited the most dismissive of glares as he was forced back in line in the most passive-aggressive way I could imagine. The whole room reeked of something having gone terribly out of step, like the carefully choreographed and rehearsed lines of the past few minutes had been derailed without warning. So, the dean continued, the warmth in his smile was still there, yet I couldn't help but feel that it was completely out of touch with the mood in the room. Without further ado, we should get on with the ceremony of scholarly rites. The tone in his voice hinted that this was a request, or something optional, yet the way he phrased it made it clear that this wasn't just a passing remark. It was a demand. A demand that had clearly spooked all of the students in the room, and had caused the few that were fidgeting with whatever it was underneath their cloaks to begin uttering murmurs that caused small localized spikes in mana radiation around themselves. Maltry stepped forward, his eyes gazing across each and every one of the students in the room with a piercing, almost unfeeling look of apathy as he held something in his hands. It was a leather-bound case, an object that seemed too plain to be something issued by a school that exuded wealth and extravagance. The first student who steps forward for the ceremony will receive 20 points credited to their peer group, 30 points to their house, and 50 extra credits to whichever class they see fit. I genuinely expected someone to have stepped up to the challenge almost immediately. Especially when considering what I could only assume was a generous compensation just for volunteering to be the first in line. So upon seeing absolutely no one stepping up to the plate, or even looking as if they were considering the offer, I knew then and there that something had definitely gone wrong. There were two distinct groups of students now from what I could tell, those that seemed to be fiddling, palming, or grasping at whatever lay hidden underneath their cloaks, and those that sat with a genuine look of defeat in their eyes. Ilyana wasn't any of these however, as the diminutive lizard seemed to have gone into a minor frenzy upon emptying the contents of his pockets onto the table. From a pocket watch to cufflinks, and an assortment of other jewels and gems that looked as if he'd recently robbed a jewelry store, it was clear he was looking for something. Something that I assumed both Thacia and Thalmin both already possessed, given how they both were likewise placing their hands nervously on what seemed to be a necklace for the former, and a sheathed dagger for the latter. It was clear that Ilyana wanted to broach a question to either Thacia or Thalmin, but couldn't, given how no one in the room dared to raise their voices, not even to whisper amongst themselves. I could see what little complexion he had on, his scaled cheeks drained to a ghostly pale green. I could also see that he didn't seem to give in just yet, as he continued fumbling with pocket after pocket, all in an attempt to find whatever it was he was looking for. The situation was beyond tense, so tense in fact that my hand had drifted purposefully towards my holstered sidearm, and my HUD was just about ready to enter tactical mode as the threat assessment training kicked in hard. Maltry's eyes throughout all of this remained steely and cold, shifting only after a good few minutes to the dean as they exchanged a knowing glance. One that the blue-robed Van Aven seemed to scowl at intently. Very well. I shall rescind the offer and begin calling out names in alphabetical, Professor. A voice emerged from one of the tables near the very front of the stage. There, a figure stood, draconic in appearance, somewhat resembling what I'd seen in artistic renditions of reptilian humanoid aliens from way back in the late 21st century. What many at the time ridiculed as being too Gorn-like, a dismissive slight that referenced the great works of old science fiction, Star Trek in this case. Regardless, this wasn't the latex masked or poorly rendered 3D models of some imaginary lizard, but the real deal. As a result, I could actually tell that his face exuded confidence. A cautionary confidence, but confidence all the same. Which was more than I could say for the rest of the students in the room. Lord Keith of Barallon Realm. You may speak. Maltry's attentions were now squarely focused on this lone student, which seemed to give the rest of the students some breathing room. If I may be allowed to be so brazen, I wish to accept the offer. I will be the first of my year group to partake in the scholarly rites. Keith bowed immediately after giving his little speech, dipping his head low. A small smile crept across Maltry's face. Not a jovial or gleeful one, but a satisfied one. A smile you'd have at the start of a particularly satisfying performance review, a professional smile devoid of any personal or emotional investment. Very well, Lord Keith. Please step forward. Maltry responded as the reptilian moved up towards the stage. His cape swishing to his right, revealing the rich tunic and robes he had underneath, and an amulet that he continued to palm even as he marched onto the stage. The entire room looked on in utter dread as Maltry placed the leather-bound case upon the floor of the stage, unbinding it with just his piercing gaze alone, opening up to reveal an old hardcover book, a quill, and a small bottle of ink that glowed black. I tried adjusting my visual sensors, zooming closer into that vial of liquid that seemed to defy everything I understood about light. However, as my eyes tried to fixate on the bottle of ink, the effect still remained the same. It was black, dark, yet it glowed and emanated light far brighter than any candle or glowing crystal in this room. The Transgracian Academy for the Magical Arts acknowledges your presence, Lord Keith Ratham of the Barallon Realm. What say you? I, Lord Keith Ratham of the Barallon Realm, recognize the enlightened and benevolent charity of the Transgracian Academy for allowing me and my line, tutelage and education within these hallowed halls. The reptilian responded, keeping his head low throughout the entire exchange. The Nexus and His Holy Majesty the King, to which the gods have bestowed the authority of sovereign, compels me as his divine agent, to grant you the rights to scholarship, under the ties that bind. Do you consent, Lord Keith Ratham? I do. It was at this point that Maltry knelt down to open the leather-bound book. As he did, I saw an impossible number of pages, far greater than what should have been possible in that relatively small space, flip through one another, melding together like a no-clip error from a video game. It took a good few minutes of silent page flipping, with hundreds upon hundreds of pages flipped per second, before it finally landed upon a new completely empty page, still miraculously in the middle of the book. Maltry stood back up, gesturing for the reptilian to kneel, which he did so without question. Pick up the quill, and sign your name, Lord Keith Ratham. After which, the rights to scholarship shall be yours, and the ties that bind shall be whole. Despite the confidence of the reptilian, his hand clearly shook as he grabbed that quill from its case. It looked as if it was heavier than it was supposed to be too, as he used both hands to carefully guide it into the ink, electrifying the air. The radiation levels were still hovering at around 200% above background levels, something that the suit continued to remind me with its angry alerts that I had to push to the side to avoid it obstructing my close observation of the scene currently unfolding in front of me. There was some struggle as the reptilian carefully guided the pen from the ink bottle to the pages of the book, and despite it being practically coated in the stuff, none of the ink seemed to drip. In fact, the entire quill was slowly being enveloped by the ink, stopping only at the tips of his clawed fingers as the jet-black substance seemed to ebb and flow like liquid mercury. With both hands, and a heavy breath, the reptilian finally put the quill to paper, both of his hands, struggling to even move the deceptively heavy quill around, as it looked more like he was dragging it across the page, rather than writing on it. Each stroke was deliberate, each movement seemed to cause the poor student to overexert himself as his muscles strained underneath his silken tunic. It took a solid minute, but as soon as he was done, so too did I get hit with a wave of radiation. This time, however, it didn't dissipate. In fact, the radiation levels rose higher and higher still. The entire room seemed to watch on in utter silence as Van face said it all, a look of utter dread. It had been a full 5 minutes of sitting and waiting. The radiation levels pushing the limits of my suit's passive shielding before it finally started to let up. As it dropped from 1415, back to 973, all the way down to the baseline 200% it had been from the start. Keith was breathing heavily by this point, his whole body shook as he stared back up at Maltry, who only stared back at him with a neutral, almost casual disinterest. Without a second for Keith to catch his breath, Maltry picked up the book, raising it high for the entire room to see. Keith's name glowed with the same black radiance as the ink, with an admittedly more muted glow. Lord Keith Ratham of the Baralon realm, henceforth you shall be known as a peer of the Transgracian Academy. Welcome to our ranks, and may the divine guide your light. Maltry spoke, before leaning in to whisper something into the lizard's pin-like ear hole. Similar to the previous instances of whispering up on stage, my LRLD couldn't seem to pick up on anything. I assumed this was a result of the professors using some sort of acoustic bubble similar to what Ileana had used prior. Lord Keith Ratham, as the first of your class to volunteer for the ceremony, I deem it fit to grant you the rights to choose the next 2 of your peers to be. The black-robed professor continued, announcing this to the whole room, who were once more put up on the chopping block. Without a second's hesitation the lizard shot his finger out to his first pick, a bear-like student who sat near the front of the stage. The Ursina, he stated plainly, before narrowing his eyes in my direction, pointing directly at me. And the Earthrealmer. I felt like I'd just been dealt a sucker punch, as my heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what the fuck was going on, but all I knew was that being exposed to that much radiation was a danger, regardless of whether or not the suit could handle it. I was spared from being the immediate next up in line, however, as the bear-like creature stepped forward first, crossing paths with Keith, who walked back down to take his seat. It didn't make it any better though. I was always the type to hate being the middle or the last to be called up for anything. It always ended up being more stressful that way. Yuvan Krovan of Alaron Realm, the Transgracian Academy for the Magical Arts acknowledges your presence. What say you? Maltry spoke in the same rehearsed fashion as before. Except this time it was clear he was settling more into his role, the satisfaction and flair from Keith's ceremony was lost, now replaced with just plain and simple protocol. I, Yuvan Krovan of Alaron Realm, humbly submit to the benevolent and benign tutelage of the Transgracian Academy for the Magical Arts, the Nexus, and the Sovereign who reigns above us all. The bear bowed deeply, even deeper than Keith, but eliciting less of a reaction from anyone on stage. The Nexus and His Holy Majesty the King, to which the gods have bestowed the authority of Sovereign, compels me as his divine agent, to grant you the rights to scholarship, under the ties that bind. Do you consent, Yuvan Krovan? Maltry replied verbatim, all without a hint of boredom, but more so with an impartial neutrality throughout it all. Yes. Pick up the quill, and sign your name, Yuvan Krovan. After which, the rights to scholarship shall be yours, and the ties that bind shall be whole. The black-robed professor spoke once more without a single hitch or variance in his speech. It definitely was a ceremony. And it was clear the guy had experience with it. Maybe too much experience. Yet unlike Keith's ceremony, things started to go south the moment the bear knelt down on both knees. The quill seemed to be easier to pick up, the bear making no effort to show himself straining to lift the writing implement. The ink, whilst still glowing and spreading, didn't stop at the bear's hand, but instead, enveloped him entirely. His entire form turned into a silhouette of its former self, almost like I was staring at a shadow of the man that had gone on stage. A shadow that still glowed with that sickening aura, as the bear seemed to find no difficulty in completing the ceremony. Unlike the strained movements, the fight just to reach the pages, and the deliberate strokes that Keith had demonstrated just moments prior, the bear seemed to put pen to paper without much fuss or fanfare. In the span of a few seconds the signing was over. A spike of radiation quickly followed as I'd expected, but it wasn't anywhere near the levels of the previous ceremony. In fact, it shot down as quickly as it had gone up, returning to the baseline 200%, followed by the inky blob of a bear returning to his former form. The ink seemingly being withdrawn back into the quill, and into the pages of the book itself. I looked around, desperate to see if anyone else was reacting to this with the same shock as I was. All I saw, however, were faces of defeat and dejection, like everyone was expecting this. I couldn't stand it anymore, as I leaned over to Thacia, and whispered softly, "What the hell's going on?" I managed out, to which the princess seemed hesitant to reply as Maltry lifted the pages of the book up in the air. Once again, there was a stark difference between Keith's signature and Yuvan's as the latter's signature glowed brighter and with a menacing dance of colors. "Emma, I am so sorry. If we had more time we could have helped prepare you for this," the princess whispered back, her voice drenched with guilt. "Prepare me for what? What the hell is all of this?" I shot back quickly, as the bear was starting to get up to leave the stage. "The binding ceremony. They bind your soul to the pages of the yearbook. Lord Keith and some of us are able to counter it, unlike Yuvan. This is how the Nexus used to do things. This is how the Nexus used to control the adjacent realms. They take princes and nobles of adjacent realms and Cadet Emma Booker of Earthrealm." Maltry's voice echoed menacingly throughout the dead silence of the room. "If you would be so kind as to not hold up the rest of the year, your presence is requested. Now." I shuddered in place at that. A knot quickly formed in my gut as I struggled to get up. If it wasn't for the suit's exoskeleton, I don't even think I'd be able to get up from my seat. With a final look of utter desperation, the princess whispered to me, and forced out a smile. "I pray that this suit of yours can dispel Tier 19 spells, or perhaps somehow, is able to resist it." My steps once more reverberated throughout the room. Except this time it felt even louder given how the whole room was silent and still. Each clank was preceded by a small whir of the motors that ran seamlessly underneath the suit, probably the first sounds of any technology more advanced than simple levers and pulleys that anyone here had heard. It didn't take long before I arrived on stage, and at this point I felt my whole body shaking, ready to lose what little contents I had in my stomach. It felt weird to be up here, to be the center of attention in front of not only all the faculty and students, but Maltry and the dean. Their eyes seemed to be fixated on me, on my suit, and on every movement I made, as the suit's height meant that I was basically staring down at them. "Cadet Emma Booker of Earthrealm, the Transgracian Academy for the Magical Arts acknowledges your presence. What say you?" Maltry once more spoke. He kept that same neutral tone as before, except this time I could detect just the slightest hint of a nervous inflection. I didn't know what to say. It was clear everyone else had speeches lined up for this, and every single speech had that same overtone of subservience and submission. It would be easy to just pull from what I'd heard, but that would be betraying literally everything I stood for when I put on the uniform. I was a cadet, a member of the United Nations Armed Forces first and foremost. I couldn't care less about whatever allegiances or politics this place had. This marked the first point in my entire life where my resolve would be tested, where I would prove that the vows spoken underneath the white and blue of the UN banner meant something more than just lip service. Another thought quickly entered my head, causing me to shudder involuntarily. I knew that if push comes to shove I'd never submit. I knew that I'd rather die than submit to a foreign power. So as the de facto representative of humanity in this strange and alien place, I couldn't waver in my duties. I would never turn my back on my country. I, Emma Booker, am a cadet of the United Nations Armed Forces. Under the Codes of Conduct and Articles of the United Nations Charter for Uniformed Services, I will never, under good conscience and a sound mind, surrender my loyalty to my nation, my people, and the country I serve. I will partake in your ceremony as a gesture of goodwill and as a demonstration of the benevolent intent of my people. I will follow the rules and regulations of your academy so long as they do not conflict with the oath I have sworn to my country. I express my desires for tutelage and for scholarship here, if you would have me. I managed out without a single stutter, surprising even myself as I tried my best and tested the very limits of the EAS classes on diplomatic dialogue. But do not mistake my cooperation for submission, for my loyalties lie with my nation, always and forever. Maltary, perhaps for the very first time, stared back at me with a look of surprise, if a single raised brow could be counted as surprise that is. The man turned back to the dean, and once more spoke without even speaking. I saw his lips move, but I didn't hear anything. After a short discussion, the black-robed professor turned towards me once more, and nodded. As your journey shall be a trial of your realm's resolve, and considering your lack of understanding of our ways and the Nexus enlightened methods, I will allow this. Now, Emma Booker of Earthrealm, pick up the quill and sign your name. After which, the rights to scholarship shall be yours, and the ties that bind shall be whole. Maltary spoke, gesturing for me to kneel, which I had to do if I was to reach for the quill and the book. My hand trembled as it reached for the quill, only stabilized by the suit's onboard systems. There weren't any warnings of radiation just yet, no localized spikes, even as I got closer and closer, until finally, I picked it up. Critical alert, localized source of mana radiation detected. Critical alert, object weight exceeding human biomechanical strength threshold, active assistance mode engaged. Object weight, 100 kilograms. Recalibrating. 120 kilograms. Recalibrating. 150 kilograms. Recalibrating. 200 kilograms. Whatever the quill was, it seemed like it was acting up just as it had with Keith. Unlike the reptilian however, I'd easily picked it up with one hand, acting as if nothing was amiss. This shocked the entire crowd. In fact, this was the first time I'd heard a few gasps. I looked around to see the shocked expression of Vanavan, and the confused expression of the dean. I continued despite this, dipping the quill into the ink only to see it doing the exact same thing it had done with Keith, as it reached my hand, and stopped. It refused to envelop me further, as it had done with the bear-like student before me. It was at this point that I heard whispers and murmurs from the crowd, and a growing look of concern from most of the faculty, as I pressed on. Moving the pen over to the book, I began signing in earnest, finding that the suit's active assistance systems basically nullified any weight added on by what I assumed was magic. This made it so that signing my signature was trivial, despite the thing now weighing close to 1/4 of a ton. However, as I reached the end of my signature, the thing stopped, refusing to budge as I found that the thing was stuck onto the pages of the book. The number remained just shy of 2000, before finally, it crashed, going all the way back down to the 200% before I was finally able to remove the quill. I looked back to the crowd, who all stared back at me in utter confusion. Indeed, there was confusion all around as I felt no different than before. It was only when I saw the book did I realize why Maltary and the rest of the staff had been peering over each other's shoulders to see the end result. My name was signed, but without even the slightest hint of a glowing aura. Not even Keefe's muted one. The Dean stepped forward for the first time throughout all of this, as he turned to Maltary, speaking to him softly, and then promptly went back in line. Cadet Emma Earthrealm. Maltary began, refusing to lift the book for the crowd as he'd done with the previous two. Henceforth you shall be known as a peer of the Transgracian Academy. Welcome to our ranks, and may the Divine guide your light, he concluded without much fanfare as I walked off stage, and back to my table, who stared at me in utter awe, except for Thacia, who smiled at me in genuine relief. Everyone remained completely fixated on me as I marched back toward my seat with loud, unwieldy steps. Each clack of unyielding metal on hardened granite resonated across a room that seemed purposefully made to amplify every sound within it. I could practically hear the micro-servos and actuators as they whirred and whizzed, accompanying each and every one of my steps. It felt like the entire world had paused just so that everyone could gawk as I retook my seat, and carefully shuffled back into place. Indeed, it was only after I'd sat back down did Maltary continue his announcements, his words however falling on deaf ears, as not a single soul wished to remove their piercing gazes from my suited form. While everyone might have seen a stoic, unflinching, unmoving hulk of a being, completely unbothered and unfazed by the events that had just transpired, things actually couldn't be any further from the truth. I was practically melting inside of the suit. Even with the coolant systems on full blast, even with my rear-facing and side-view cameras turned off, I still couldn't shake that gut-churning feeling of being the unwanted center of attention. My whole body shook with the same feeling you'd get after completely making an ass of yourself at some important social function. It was maddening and all-consuming. My spiral into the pits of utter dread was just about to take another leap. If it wasn't for a rogue sensation on my hand. It was the unmistakable feeling of another person's touch being transmitted via my gloves and into the undersuit beneath it. I could feel a reassuring squeeze, and the slightest bit of tickling from the feather-covered appendage, which immediately clued me into just exactly who it was that had extended this gesture of solidarity. A gesture so sorely needed when the entire world seemed more than willing to distance itself from me. Emma, don't focus on anything else. Just look at me, all right? Thacia whispered softly, which was more than enough for my audio suite to enhance and isolate, as I dulled out all other sounds around the room to zero in on this one, single, point of focus. I could only nod in response as my two opaque lenses stared back at the avian unflinchingly. Yet despite what most would have seen as the unfeeling eyes of a suit of armor, as Ileana had pointed out, it was clear that she saw something else. It almost felt as if she was actually looking at me, making actual eye contact, rather than just seeing me for the helmet and lenses, which would have been a far easier thing to do. It was then that I wished I could have detinted the damned lenses, to actually make eye contact. I knew that it felt like I was doing just that, but I wasn't, and worse of all, I couldn't. All Thacia could see right now were two unfeeling lenses, and I hated that. Despite all the training I received, and the trial runs they'd put me through, nothing could have prepared me for what was effectively a new life in an entirely alien skin. A skin that had everything I needed to survive, and then some, but one that brought with it unforeseen limitations that were only now being felt. It's over now, Thacia continued, her hand squeezing my own once again, as I suddenly felt a strange warmth flooding over me. Everyone remained completely fixated on me as I marched back toward my seat with loud, unwieldy steps. Each clack of unyielding metal on hardened granite resonated across a room that seemed purposefully made to amplify every sound within it. I could practically hear the micro-servos and actuators as they whirred and whizzed, accompanying each and every one of my steps. It felt like the entire world had paused just so that everyone could gawk as I retook my seat, and carefully shuffled back into place. Indeed, it was only after I'd sat back down did Maltary continue his announcements, his words however falling on deaf ears, as not a single soul wished to remove their piercing gazes from my suited form. While everyone might have seen a stoic, unflinching, unmoving hulk of a being, completely unbothered and unfazed by the events that had just transpired, things actually couldn't be any further from the truth. I was practically melting inside of the suit. Even with the coolant systems on full blast, even with my rear-facing and side-view cameras turned off, I still couldn't shake that gut-churning feeling of being the unwanted center of attention. My whole body shook with the same feeling you'd get after completely making an ass of yourself at some important social function. It was maddening and all-consuming. My spiral into the pits of utter dread was just about to take another leap. If it wasn't for a rogue sensation on my hand. It was the unmistakable feeling of another person's touch being transmitted via my gloves and into the undersuit beneath it. I could feel a reassuring squeeze, and the slightest bit of tickling from the feather-covered appendage, which immediately clued me into just exactly who it was that had extended this gesture of solidarity. A gesture so sorely needed when the entire world seemed more than willing to distance itself from me. "Emma, don't focus on anything else, just look at me all right," Thacia whispered softly, which was more than enough for my audio suite to enhance and isolate, as I dulled out all other sounds around the room to zero in on this one, single, point of focus. I could only nod in response as my two opaque lenses stared back at the avian unflinchingly. Yet despite what most would have seen as the unfeeling eyes of a suit of armor, as Ilyana had pointed out, it was clear that she saw something else. It almost felt as if she was actually looking at me, making actual eye contact, rather than just seeing me for the helmet and lenses, which would have been a far easier thing to do. It was then that I wished I could have detinted the damned lenses, to actually make eye contact. I knew that it felt like I was doing just that, but I wasn't, and worse of all, I couldn't. All Thacia could see right now were two unfeeling lenses, and I hated that. Despite all the training I received, and the trial runs they'd put me through, nothing could have prepared me for what was effectively a new life in an entirely alien skin. A skin that had everything I needed to survive, and then some, but one that brought with it unforeseen limitations that were only now being felt. "It's over now," Thacia continued, her hand squeezing my own once again, as I suddenly felt a strange warmth flooding over me.